Hi, if you're subscribed to me for world building videos, I'd just like to let you know that this video will have absolutely nothing to do with world building, and you should feel no obligation to watch it. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who likes to jump around a lot between projects, so though I will resume the world building series I've been working on, this video will instead be about a sewing project I've recently finished. For this project, I'm going to be creating my own version of this dress I found on Pinterest. Tracking down the pin, I found that it is from the 1950s and was sold on Etsy in 2010. I found the original listing, in which the seller had great photos, close-ups, and details about construction in the description. It was originally a heavy-looking wool with what looks to me like a cotton lining. The front of the bodice has two parallel darts at the side of the bust, but no vertical darts. The back bodice has vertical darts and small darts around the neckline. The listing says the original dress had pockets, and there are thin belt loops, though the original belt has been lost. The back of the dress closes with a metal zipper. The skirt is flared, and the detail that drew my attention to this dress is the way the patterns are lined up to create a V shape in the skirt. The neckline is one of those wide 50s boat necks, and the sleeves appear to be elbow length, with decorative buttons. I can't tell if the sleeves split there or how far, but I can tell that there are no buttonholes, so the buttons are static. I've labeled this video vintage inspired because I'm not any kind of expert in vintage fashion, and because I have no desire to make a perfectly accurate vintage reproduction anyways. I do plan on making the sleeves longer because I like long sleeves in the winter, and the skirt a bit shorter. I'm also not going to be able to use vintage accurate materials, namely natural fibers, mostly because wool is insanely expensive, but also because I have no idea where I would have found a print like this anyways. Instead, I'll be using a large plaid I found at Joann's and a basic polyester lining fabric. The zipper will be a plastic invisible zipper, and I've got some matching embroidery floss to make the belt loops with. To make the dress, I started with this Berta pattern. It's one I've used before, and I like it because it's a basic fit and flare dress that I can easily hack apart and tape back together for any variation I want. Also, it is one of the few modern dress patterns I've seen that can make a long, fitted sleeve from non-stretch fabrics. I started by tracing the existing pattern pieces to paper, then cutting them up and mostly guessing on the adjustments. I shifted the dart from the vertical front to the side bust and distributed it between two darts. I also changed the neckline, making it wider and adding darts at the back. Then I made a mock-up of the bodice and sleeves out of scrap fabric to try on and fit. The biggest problem with the mock-up was the sleeves. They were way too tight and very restrictive of arm movements. The bodice was also quite tight in the bust. Normally I like my clothes to be fitted, but I have a tendency to make them too fitted, so I'm going to try adding 1/4 of an inch to the bust and waist. The waist might end up looser than I typically prefer, but since I'm planning on wearing a belt with this dress, it shouldn't be a problem. The new bust darts sit a tad low, so I'll raise them, and I think I'll add a bit more length to the sleeves. Googling it, I found a suggestion that for tight sleeves, the solution is to add fabric at the armpit, which was counterintuitive for me, but it did end up helping. Also, the boat neck needed to slope down a bit more. Now that I'm feeling more or less confident in my pattern, I'm going to cut out the pieces. I'm going to attempt to match the plaids, though I'm not the best at it. This is kind of a booger to do, and you waste a ton of fabric, but I do really love the crisp end results. It just speaks volumes about the care that was put into a garment. I've run into an unexpected problem cutting out the skirt. I have 2 lengths of the same fabric, 1.5 yards that I found at my local Joann's, and 2 additional yards I bought at joanns.com. However, the 2 yards I bought online appeared to be shrunk somehow, or maybe woven differently altogether. I have no idea, but the problem is that since I cut the skirt fronts from the store-bought fabric, there is now absolutely no way I will get the patterns to line up between the front and back skirts. I would offer words of advice, but honestly I've never had this happen before. I guess I can file it under the category of perfectionist things to just let go of. Once I've cut out all of the pattern pieces, I'm recutting everything out of the lining fabric. I didn't bother to film this, but it went much faster because there was no pesky pattern matching. The first thing to sew is the darts, all 16 of them. Then the bodice fronts and backs can be sewn together at the shoulders and sides. The sleeve has 2 seams, and I would be very curious if anyone in the audience knows the purpose of the separate panel. Then I sew the pocket pieces to the outer skirt sides and sew the front and back seams of the outer skirt. All of these seams can be repeated for the lining, and the skirt lining can go ahead and have all 4 seams sewn at once, as the pockets do not affect the lining. Now would have been an excellent time to iron all of these seams. Unfortunately, I did not, so some complicated iron finagling was required later on. I will not be serging much of this dress since the lining will encapsulate most of the bodice, but the skirt lining will open at the hem, so I feel that serging all of the vertical seams is necessary, especially since this acrylic is fraying so bad. Then I can finish the outer skirt by sewing the side seams up to about 3.5 inches past the base of each pocket, then sewing around the pockets. Now I can line up and pin together the skirt shell and lining. I'm going to sew them to the bodice with the skirt sandwiched between the bodice shell and lining so that when the bodices are flipped up, the seam will be encapsulated and there'll be no shifting between the shell and lining.
The only trick is to stop a few inches from each center back and finish the two linings and the two shell pieces separately so you can sew the zipper between them. Before I close up too much of the lining, I'll go ahead and make the belt loops. I'm doing this by crocheting 2 strands of embroidery floss, making a small chain about 1.5 inches long, with extra length along the 2 strands. I'll use a big needle to take the strands through the bodice about 1/8 inch apart, and then tie them together and cut the excess inside the bodice. I'm sure there are other ways to do this, but this method is pretty easy and seems strong enough to me. I'm going to go ahead and install the zipper, mostly because sleeves are annoying. Zippers will turn out nicer if you baste them in place first. Because they are so thick and bulky, pins will do weird things to your fabric. Also, because I'm trying to line up the plaids, basting is mandatory. Then I will sew the zipper to the shell, only with an invisible zipper foot on the machine. It turned out pretty good, not 100% perfect, but I'm okay with it. Now is a great time to try on your dress, so if adjustments need to be made, you can do that before you sew down the lining. I'm happy with it the way it is, so I'm going to go ahead and pin the lining around the zipper and hand stitch it down, using a slip stitch so no stitches are visible from the exterior. Now I have run out of room to procrastinate and it's time to do the sleeves. My favorite way to hem lined sleeves is to trim 3/4 inch from the lining, and then sew the lining and shell right sides together around the hem with about 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you can flip wrong sides together and baste around the sleeve cap. This will finish off the hem nicely, but the downside is you won't be able to adjust it later, so commit. Now I'm going to sew both layers of the sleeves to the outer shell only of the bodice. With all of my pattern hacking, I've somehow wound up with slightly less room in the sleeves than there is in the sleeve hole, so they're not lining up. The best solution I came up with that didn't require too much backtracking was to sew the shoulder seams of the bodice in by about 1/8 inch. That wasn't quite enough, so there was a tiny bit of puckering, but it was the most I could afford to lose. The last thing to do with the sleeves is to clip and trim the seams, then sew down the lining. To do this, I sewed a basting stitch by machine around the lining sleeve eye, which would have been much easier to do if I'd thought of doing it earlier. Then I'm going to clip around the seam and fold the lining inside, pinning it down around the armhole. I'll hand stitch this down, using a slip stitch again so nothing is visible from the outside. Now to tidy up the collar. I'm going to baste the shell and lining together around the neckline, then use the pattern pieces to cut a facing, factoring in the darts and the allowance I lost on the shoulder seams. Iron these, and then iron up about 1/2 inch around the outer edges and the center back. Now pin and sew this facing around the neckline of the dress. Trim the seams by about half and clip it. Turn the facing to the inside of the dress and pin it down. It might help to do this while the dress is on a dress form inside out, so that everything lays smoothly. Then you will slip stitch this facing down, only catching the lining fabric so no stitches go through the plaid. All that's left of the dress is to hem it. I'm going to cut quite a bit off of the hem. I prefer shorter dresses in the winter, especially when I'm going to be wearing tights anyways. Plus, I think the shorter skirt balances the longer sleeves. I'll measure up from the floor evenly around the shell of the skirt, then measure for a 2-inch hem and trim the excess. This was another case where poor planning led to weird ironing methods. I'm hemming this skirt by hand, only catching a couple threads of the skirt at a time to minimize the visibility of the stitching. Then it gets ironed and goes back on the dress form. I pinned the shell of the skirt out of the way, then measured and marked the lining skirt 1 inch higher than the shell. I will also be giving it a narrower hem, 1 inch wide instead of 2 inches. I sewed this hem by machine, as it will not be visible, and I have to say this is the sloppiest hem I've done in a long time, but at this point I was pretty done with the project. This hem gets one last iron, and then all that's left is to tack the two skirts together. There are 4 seams, so I'm crocheting 4 more little chains, exactly like the ones I made for the belt loops. I used a small hook and only about 15 stitches. Then I tacked the skirts together, 1 chain to each seam right at the top of the hem. This will keep the lining straight, but it will have enough give to avoid puckering. Much better than my old method, which was just to tack them with a few stitches. The dress needs a bit more ironing, but it is now complete. However, I want to add the missing belt, and I've decided to make a matching belt and buckle covered in the same fabric, one of those vintage eccentricities I personally love. To make the belt, I'm cutting 2 lengths of fusible interfacing to the exact length and width I want the belt to end up at. Then I'll fuse them to a length of leftover plaid fabric. Trim the edges to between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, and then fold those edges over and iron them down, using the interfacing as a guide. Line those 2 halves up and slip stitch them together. This would have been much faster to do by putting right sides together and sewing them by machine, but they turned out fine anyways. The belt buckle was experimental. I didn't want to use the prong of the buckle because I didn't want to make eyelets in the belt, and because I wanted to have as little metal showing as possible, so I removed the prong with a pair of wire cutters and flipped the buckle backwards, hoping this would give the fabric enough tension. Actually covering it was a bit of trial and error, as I have no idea how they were historically covered, and basically made it up as I went. But what ended up working best was to fold and iron both long edges of the fabric in, Then stitch it around the buckle, keeping tension on the thread and making the stitches on the inside of the buckle. This worked well enough, but there is probably a cleaner way I could have done it. Then I hand-stitched the belt to the buckle. The dress is complete, and overall I am really happy with the way it turned out. The only complaint I have about the fit is that the shoulders and caps of the sleeves still ended up slightly too tight, something to alter the next time I use that pattern. And in the future I might skip the boat neck. I prefer crew necks on these types of dresses, something that can be paired with different types of collars. I started altering the pattern on Sunday and finished the dress Thursday evening. I didn't keep track of time very well with this project, but I'm guessing it ended up being somewhere around 25 hours start to finish. The plaid fabric cost $7.01 from Joann's and $22.28 from Joanns.com. The lining cost $9.64, the zipper cost $4.31, the embroidery floss cost $2.58, and the buckle cost $3.45. The thread and interfacing I already had. So the total cost of new materials for this dress was $49.27. I would definitely make it again, maybe out of natural fibers if I can find a good vintage wool to use.
Well, thanks for watching, thanks for commenting, and I'll be back to world building in the next video.